Well, I was at a conference last week. Yes, it was last week. It's only Tuesday, Tony. You ever have one of those weeks where you're like, I'm pretty sure it's Friday at 3:30 p.m. and then you're like, no, it's Tuesday at 8:49 a.m. is
Yeah,
what time it is.
frequently, unfortunately.
And in my case, it's not frequently because it's just like some malaise of work. It's just I've just lost track of time, and I don't know what's happening. Anyways, I was speaking of losing track of time. I was at this conference, configuration management camp, but with no vowels, last week, and there were two major themes, I think, other than like people talking about configuration management and all sorts of things like that. But there was a lot of talks about open source, and I think the theme there was, I don't know if you come across this, but nowadays the open source community is always freaking out about if they're gonna be like the same as one would. That's a great summary of it, but we'll get to that. And then the other thing that came up a lot was the let's call it AI versus AI no people. Just kind of like trying to sort out what was going on there. And so I thought these might be two interesting topics to discuss, to get your view on and see what's going on out there. So let's start with the open source one. I think
Yeah.
I think like I was watching a webinar from some of our coworkers, and they cited like a CNCF survey that like, I don't know, 98% of stacks have open source in them somewhere, which I suppose is like, obvious. it, it,
Yes.
it makes you wonder what those 2% are doing.
Right.
Like what exactly that is. Probably just an error in the surveying when it was done. But I think the legitimate thing that in the open source community people are freaked out about is, I guess, like if the nature of open source like stays the same, and that nature being that there's people who they're not always volunteers. Including at our company, lots of people who work on open source are actually employed by someone else.
Right.
But there's still this sense of like, uh, there's not always like a financially sound reason to do open source. And even especially if you're a large or not especially, but if you're a larger organization and the open source already exists, you kind of like, you're incented to just like take the open source and not contribute to it so much. So you see this with public cloud providers and other things. And I don't know, that's kind of over here on the table. And then the other thing on the table is just the ongoing, like, kind of connected to that is like, so who's going to pay for the development of open source? Like, and I guess the combination of those two things are usually the people who are upset in the open source world or worrying. They're like, open source creates all this value, and it's creating this value for some people, and they don't pay us for it.
Mm.
And then this leads to like, so how are we going to fund open source? And does open source have a future? And then you add in, we've got AI stuff where just like code is going crazy and people can write their own stuff. So the open source people are always, I think, I've followed them for a long time, and I don't know if I've ever participated in open source in so much as I've committed something to anywhere. But they're always worried about something, which is fine. But now I think they've got a particularly new type of worry with the confluence of these three things, especially with just like, what are we going to do with all this code people are submitting to us, and how are we going to handle that? But so with that context, my question for you, Tony, is does open source ever come up in your conversations as like a thing, or is it just like, we just all assume the toilet's flush, so we don't talk about it?
Yeah, I think it's the latter a little bit for sure. I think the more interesting things that come up around open source with the enterprise is uh, how to kind of take advantage of it and sort of advocate for it and push for it when
Mm,
possible. And I think a lot of companies, I think, struggle internally with something that I would call sort of like the inner source model as well. So I think there are some parallels between those two things. And maybe they're related to some of the things that are pulling on the open source community. But that might be an interesting conversation. But no, I think it hasn't for a while, and I don't know if that's because it's not a thing or just because there's other topics that are taking all the oxygen out of the room.
Yeah,
But
yeah. Well, there is that.
yeah, we
That's
can imagine what those are. But yeah, it hasn't really come up for a while. I think it's just a given. Like I think everyone's running it, and there's a lot of talk around, obviously secure supply chains and stuff like that, which I think is tangential to that conversation. But open source as a whole doesn't come up a whole lot for me in a lot of my
yeah.
conversations.
I mean, my impression is that well, sometime over the past probably 10 years, like everyone's at the position, everyone in the enterprise, if you will, is like in the position you're going over, which is like, yeah, of course we use it. Like
Yeah,
that's and a little bit of what I think people were working on for the past, let's say 3 or 5 years, was like, let's make sure we're being smart about it, right? That
yeah.
we can patch things and log4j this and blah blah blah. Like we need a newer version of that. But maybe it's good that we don't have a new version. But and then you've got we talked about hardened images a while back. So it seems like people have a handle on how to secure and govern open source stuff.
I would agree with that. Yeah,
And maybe, I mean, not even maybe. Like I often I don't really hear conversations about like, oh, those developers just downloading and using whatever they want, right? Like
yeah.
it's almost like, even I'm sure there's exceptions, but there's enough of the developers, that I'm putting in air quotes, that they're like, yeah, that would be a bad idea. Like,
Yeah. Do you watch that show, The Bear? Have you ever seen that?
oh yeah, I've seen like the first season or so.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
a fantastic show. But there's something on there that the head chef kind of talks about. He has this list and he calls it the non-negotiables. And
Mm.
and I think like the enterprise, right? The developers, I think we've settled on a really good set of what those non-negotiables are. And I think that's one of them. And by the one of them I mean is um yes, you can use software, but only from like this secured place that we've, blessed
Yeah.
and approved. And like there's a way of getting things in there. And I think companies have gotten much better at being responsive to their development communities and ensuring that the things they want to use are there and available and scanned. So I would agree. I would say it's one of those non-negotiables, the same way that, hey, we only use one, source repository. We only, we get all of our software from a secured, sort of place within our company. So I would agree. I think it's a non-negotiable now, and I think the companies have done a good job of maturing in that aspect.
Well, I want to hear about this inner sourcing thing, but before we get to that, like to do a little bit of like ponder soapboxing. It
Yeah,
does, one of the things the funding and participation in the open source community, like that's I was going to say that's always like vexed or confused me because I can't use subtle words, but that let's say has always been there, and given your background and also people you talk with, maybe you'd have something interesting to say about this. But it seems like with exceptions that prove the rule, so to speak, like enterprises, end users, they don't really seem to get involved in the open source community very much. Like the primary way they get involved, which is fantastic, is like paying for support and like
right.
paying for it. But when it comes to like, and again, there's exceptions, but when it comes to like contributing things back, or like, I don't know, maybe there's like bug submitting that happens, but it doesn't seem like a normal thing for like the people in large organizations to participate in that community. But I might have not have looked at this in a while. I mean, do you ever encounter people who are like submitting patches or like committing
No,
stuff?
no, and I think not really. I think every once in a while you'll get an organization that will brand this big developer experience group internally and kind of talk about how they're contributing back to open source and stuff. But I feel like it's almost like a marketing ploy that lasts for like 3 years in order for them to
Mm,
attract talent and stuff. So I think when the companies when there was a huge shortage of talent and the companies were really interested in attracting developers, I think that was sort of
Yeah.
a chic thing to do. But I think what I see typically is on the tech provider companies, like if you're looking at the big cloud providers, I'm sure they do. Like we have
Yes.
our, obviously we have a huge group of people that do that. But I would say if you're more on the business side, direct to consumer, like business facing side, I don't think it's happening that frequently.
Yeah.
And there's probably a bunch of reasons for that. And, and I could speculate, but yeah, I don't see a lot of that.
Well, first of all, you're probably used a word maybe the first time anyone's used it this year, chic. That doesn't really come up very much anymore, which is that's great. And yeah,
It's my
the
wife's influence on me, I'm sure.
the first thing you said, like I was just talking with someone yesterday, and they brought up an example several years ago of how some organization wanted to we're starting up an open source group for exactly that reason.
Yep.
Just for employment, like retention and attracting people, which when you much so than me, but when you're working weekly doing business cases and ROI stuff, you're kind of
Right.
like, what is going on here? Like this, I mean, again, it's like virtuously good, but doing it for that reason, I think the main problem with it is like the sustainability of it, right? Like if
Right.
it's connected to like we're doing it for hiring and staffing, like I don't think that's going to last for that long, right? And so it just doesn't become a sustainable practice to do.
Yeah, and I would say I don't think it's a big surprise also if you, especially looking at an executive level, the leverage has certainly shifted in the technology sort of labor force where sort of going into in the tail end of COVID, I felt like the workforce had all the leverage. But now I would say that leverage has shifted back to the employers instead of the employees. And so you're getting a lot of return to office mandates, right? You're getting a lot of things that are, I would say, sort of challenging the workforce to decide if they still want to be at companies and things.
Mm.
And it's all because the leverage has shifted back to the employers, and AI is a big part of that, layoffs and so forth. So, yeah, I would say there's not a lot of incentive to do those things right now, probably for that reason.
So tell me about what you're thinking about so if you've got open source in the world, you could think of inner sourcing, which I always makes me think of that Inner Space movie, if you remember that.
Yes,
Was that Dennis Quaid who was in that?
Matthew McConaughey, I think. Right? Is
Oh,
it
well, that's Interstellar. But then
Interstellar?
there was
Yes,
Inner Space,
Inner
where
Space.
I'll have to go look that one up. But
No,
anyways,
I think you're right. That was, yeah. We're definitely showing our age, Kote.
well, quality.
That's
It's
right.
unforgettable. So what is yeah, like what do you see as far as like that, and by inner sourcing, I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but it's sort of like we've got a bunch of developers in our organization, not only all working on code, but a lot of it is probably similar. They could be using not only reusing code that exists, but also helping each other out with things. And so I haven't checked in on this a while, but there's been a lot of initiatives over the years to set up like, let's do that. Let's formalize it so it's
Yes.
it's less formal. But what have you seen in that area?
Yeah, so there was a really big push I've seen at that. I won't mention the company, but I've seen a couple of really big public pushes for that. And I can certainly speak from my own experience. We tried some of this, and there are some good things that come out of it, but I think where the big hang up happens is on the support side. And so
Mm,
I don't think most groups, when they do this, that's their full time job. And instead, it's more the approach of we're solving a problem. We think others could benefit from us solving this problem. So, we're going to sort of advocate and advertise this thing, and you guys should take advantage of it and use it. And that all sounds great. And I think there's some value in doing that. But then when you talk about having to scale that thing and support that thing, then I think you start taking on additional overhead that you probably aren't budgeted for. And I think that's where it really comes down to is if you're looking at P&Ls internally within an organization, how do you fund these things? Because the support piece and the scale piece become very important, and these things aren't typically tied to a specific business P&L typically. And so I think it gets very challenging on how the funding and supporting of it happens.
Yeah, that's I wouldn't have really thought of that. It, probably to any degree when I think of that I would think about this, but it is. I mean, it's similar to the talk. It's kind of a smaller version of like one of the reasons you shouldn't build your own platform is like you
Correct.
don't really. It's well in a platform you sort of you are kind of you know that you'll need to support it and run it, but you
Right.
still like don't exactly know the degree to what that means usually, typically. But with like an inner sourcing thing, I would imagine a lot of people don't even think about that, right? Like
Yeah.
about and don't think about the volume of requests that you would have and needing to do things. I don't know. Maybe there's some people do, but I bet it's kind of unexpected at some point that now you have to support it.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of aspects to it. And I think one of them that really comes to mind is when something goes wrong, all of a sudden there's, it's a all hands on deck to kind of get to the root cause and figure out
Mm.
this and remediate it. And I think what happens is you get kind of called into a support case and you're like, wait, what do I have to do with this? And it's like, oh, because we're using this thing that you built and you're supporting and you're the expert on it, right? And it's like, okay, well, I don't know when I created that thing if I signed up for this, right? And I think that's one of the things. And then there's traceability. So a lot of, if you look at vertical silos and lines of business within companies, there's not a lot of communication between them. And I
Mm.
think that this is one of those areas that can make that kind of cause even more problems, or it sort of uh, illuminate the fact that you don't do a lot of communicating. And so I think that's what I mean
Right,
by
right.
supportability is you kind of get called into these situations and you're like, okay, for me and my time and my team and our budget and our business, we did not allocate resources to get pulled into these situations. And I think it's kind of more political, I would say, but
Right,
um,
right.
it's valid, nonetheless. Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's at least like three types of capacity that you have to plan for. One is like, I mean, it depends if it's a service versus just like a chunk of code. Like one, there's like the actual running it and serving up whatever it is, right? Which is more if you've got a service that you're running, if a bunch of people want to use it, you've got to plan for that capacity. And then two, there's like the capacity of we were saying of support, like just the staff time that you have to answer questions about it, diagnose problems, and then even write and release fixes.
Right.
But then the other one is like to wrap up a bunch of things. It's like organizational capacity,
Yeah.
which is I guess to make up a story that would illustrate it. Like you could have the payments team has like some reusable piece of code or service that the ledger team uses or something. I don't know.
Right.
And the payments team is like, oh, this would be several years ago. We like Apple Pay is gonna open up in 2 months, so we're working on that. And then all of a sudden, the ledger team is like, hey, we're using this component for you, and we really need a new feature added to it for the thing that we have to do in 2 months. And then
Yeah.
you've got like executive fight.
Yep. Exactly.
And so there's like that kind of like organizational capacity that you also have to account for, which is often not fun.
Yeah. Yeah, and
to
it's
deal with.
it's tough. Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why hyperscalers and the cloud providers and stuff, it doesn't get mentioned a lot, but I think that's one of the best benefits, right, is the fact that you use a thing and you get an itemized receipt of what you're using, how much and what it costs. And I think basically what you're doing is you're sort of releasing an internal SaaS product, but you're probably not good or experienced at doing that. And that's like a whole skill set and a whole industry, right? And I think when you're asking, an LOB development team that's sort of more business facing and solving a concrete set of problems, now all of a sudden you're like, yes, and by the way, we want you to, on the side become like a world class SaaS operator. And it's like that's like a whole different ball of wax.
Yeah. It becomes it becomes that like whenever you're in like a siloed organization, it seems like prioritizing across silos is very difficult.
It is the
Like,
most difficult, right?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
that's
and
yeah.
you know, on paper, there are people who look over the silos, or in the U.S. government, they're always called a czar or something, which I don't know how that came about. But that's also not thrilling.
Yeah,
That role is
and I
difficult.
think what I typically see is you'll get a leader at a sufficiently high level who will come in and have aspirations of what they want to happen, and it's like, hey, we're going to start doing this, and we're going to work together, and you're going to all solve this, and then I think what everyone does is they sort of like put their head down and say, well, this too shall pass, right? Like the reality is,
Right.
like, you can want all of these things, but it's, as a very, this mentor of mine and ex leader of mine that I really respected, she would always say it's like changing tires on a moving car. It's like the reality is it's just very difficult to do, and it takes time, and there's an opportunity cost, and there's an investment that's required that usually doesn't come with that aspiration. So
Right.
it's just it's nice to want it, and I think it's something to strive for, but the reality of doing it is a different thing.
Right. The leadership team usually doesn't ask for the for the lug nut bar
Right.
and start changing, helping you change the tires. And they just
Yes, exactly.
say
Yeah,
something and hop in their car with perfectly good tires and drive away.
exactly.
It's fine.
Yeah.
They got other things to worry about, I guess. Well, so the second topic that came up, and I think it's a little more speculative than, well, a lot more speculative than the whole open source thing, is so like when I was there was a it'll be published outside of the live stream. Like there's live streams of the conference, including the talk that I gave and a podcast recording that I did, available if you want to sort through like 6 hours of video, which is fine. But they'll chop it up into things. But there was a talk from one of the Chef co-founders, Adam Jacob, and he was like, it was like perhaps in a good way. I liked his talk. So if I sound like I'm making fun of it, I'm not. Like it was the most over the top, like whatever the positive version of vitriolic is, just enthusiastic about AI. He was just going over it again and again. And I'll tell you, like one of the things that was most interesting about it is, well, there's two things, but the thing that was most interesting programming wise is he was going over a list of like, we have all these ideas in programming, not necessarily in platform engineering, maybe there too, but we have these laws or these principles. Like there's a famous one, dry, don't repeat yourself. And it's basically like within a code base, anything that you do, it would be nice if there was only one chunk of code that did it. So like, to pick a very simple thing, if you have a pagination algorithm or framework, like you should probably only have one in one place that you just reuse over and over. We were just talking about that. And
Yeah.
so that is like a fundamental law of programming, which is great because it means that you don't have to understand all these different things when you want to diagnose it. You have one place to go. It like looks the same wherever it is, etc. And so amongst other ones, I'm just picking this one thing. He was like, but if you're generating your code, it doesn't matter.
Right.
Like, and it was part of a larger point he was making, because this gets to the second thing is I get the sense that most people there really didn't like AI. And these were a bunch of like operations people. Maybe you would call them platform engineers. They're a little more like crotchety. And kind of like, more system administrators and ops people, but definitely DevOpsy people. They're the people who should be platform engineers. Maybe
Right.
there's some of them in there. But, he made another good point. He was like, a lot of people don't like this generated code. And then the point he was making is like, well, it's just because it doesn't match your taste. And that's why he was going over the dry principle and other things.
Interesting.
It's just like it's not the way you want to do code as a human, but it doesn't matter if the AI does it, right? Like you shouldn't get upset about it. So what was interesting about that is he was talking about programming, and most of the people are not programmers, but that's fine. but it did kind of get a discussion going, especially in my head, thinking about like, all right, so if we were to apply the equivalent of code generation, I don't know what you would call it, config generation, glue generation, to
Yeah.
like platform engineering or operations work you do, like I think it would be the same thing from a high level, right? Because a lot of work that you're doing in operations work is files.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And configuration and doing stuff with files. And that's kind of what programming is files.
Yes. Yeah. So I think we talked about this a little before as well. When you brought this up, I was like, I don't even know where I would start with that, because again, being a huge fan, obviously, of a sort of black box, all pre-built, PaaS kind of thing, right? Um, there was a lot less sort of that kind of work that I think typically we would do. But I think, to your point, like, that's what makes the conversation interesting, is like, okay, what does that look like? And I think it kind of, for me personally, I think it kind of speaks to, I guess the conversation would be one way to frame the conversation, and correct me if I'm wrong, but is it possible to take AI in that context and apply it to a bunch of open source stuff and get something that looks a little bit like a PaaS, maybe, right?
Yeah. I
Yeah,
think that's just to make maybe just I was going to say 3 goalposts, but I don't know if there's a game where there's 3. But kind of like a grading of things. Like 1, I think that's the maximal thing,
right.
which is
Yeah,
interesting. Is just like, it's not so much that I'm building my own platform, it's that I'm AIing.
yeah.
I'm vibing my own platform
Yeah,
or
yeah,
whatever. And then I think in the middle is kind of is kind of what you are indicating, is like, I'll use a Cloud Foundry example. Like, everyone's always like, there's like this configuration and provisioning thing underneath Cloud Foundry called Bosch. And this is the part in the presentation where someone talks about Borg and letters and blah blah blah. And everyone's always like, "Oh, Bosch is so difficult." I've never actually looked at it, so I don't know. But it's sort of like, yeah, but what if you just had the AI generate it? Then who cares? And then so like the difficulty of this part of the stack is no longer a difficulty, right?
right.
And kind of applying that up and down the stack of like, maybe it's a big lift, even if you have like a finished out PaaS like Tanzu platform or a Cloud Foundry thing. Like, maybe it's a big lift to like add a service to it, and to kind of do that work. But now maybe it's not, right? Like
Right.
it, and then on the least amount is sort of like, I don't know, we need to make a new build pack, or, in our world, or like, there's still like tons of little files that you just do stuff with.
Yeah.
And like generating those would be easy. So that's kind of like the 3 things I could think of. But so let's back up to where you were, to the maximal thing of just
Yeah.
like, we're watching season 3 of Stranger Things, and you remember the monster? Have you ever seen that? You remember the
Yes.
monster
Yeah.
basically like decomposes animals and then takes their goopy stuff and then recomposes it into himself?
Yeah.
Like, either we don't want that,
Right.
but maybe something else.
Yeah. I don't know. And I think, for me personally, the reason why I am in that position is, I think, if you're looking back at the people at the conference, I'm probably a little bit more I'm not on the skeptic side per se, but I think it's going to take us a lot longer to get to where we want to be than I think most people think. Um, I I just I don't know. It doesn't relate to me. Like, I don't know what that
What you
would.
would do with it?
Yeah, like, I don't know how you
Yeah.
would get started. And so here's my thing on it. Like, I think most people that I talk to, that appears, that are still in certain companies, and I think there's a lot of work going into the whole ROI thing around AI. And it's a mixed bag right now on some of that stuff. But I think there's promise. But at the same time, I have a buddy that used AI to write an app for his children's sports thing, and like, all of a sudden, he's got thousands of people signing up for it and doing a thing. So
Right.
right, and so I think what I'm trying to get to is, I think there are opportunities in sort of these smaller contained environments to do things. But I think where I still struggle is that's a very much more complex thing, and like gluing that much stuff together to do an
Yeah.
end product. Now, that being said, I think there are optimizations to be had. So could you do it in theory with less people, for example? Could you do it quicker? I think there are some acceleration factors to it possibly, but I think in terms of ensuring that it actually works, or that it's scalable, or that it's day two kind of things where you're trying to debug it, or figure out what went wrong. I think those pose really serious challenges to something of
Mhm.
that scale, and I think that's where most of the apprehension and probably the biggest risk of failure would come from.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of good points in there. One of them is I, I'm always cautious of being like, well, we're a special edge case, whatever allegiance I have,
Right.
but like probably at a large scale, a platform is a complicated enough thing that you probably do want to use, just like anyone else, you want to use like code generation stuff to help you as a tool, but it's probably not going to remove a lot of the problems of building your own platform. Because
Right.
a lot of the issues you have of building and running your own platform are they fall into that bucket we were talking about earlier, organizational capacity. Like
Yeah.
just a willingness to keep paying attention to it, to develop it, whatever. We got a whole white paper on it and several episodes here. But the actual assembling, that first assembling of the thing isn't the biggest deal. It's like everything that happens after that is difficult. Now, and the other, I guess you're also reminding me that I think this is maybe like a year or so ago, but I remember some of the early people in our platform community. They were using AI stuff not necessarily for the platform, but just for like what I always think of as just better search, right? Like get all of the docs that you have and all of the sources and just load it up however you want to into a chat bot. And I think that is probably a great use, because not only do you get like all the public information that you could get about that platform, but there's all the information that's only inside in the organization.
Right.
Not in the inner sourcing way we were talking about, but just like the policies and things like that. And I think also probably what's great about that is maybe things are different in other organizations, but most organizations I worked at, it's kind of like a cobbler's kids wear no shoes situation, where like your own documentation is often the worst. And so like getting some help to like make your internal documentation better is
Yeah.
always nice. But
Yeah, and I think that's obviously, I think, one of the early success stories of AI and RAG and so forth, is this dissemination of information, right? That that's just out there, probably information that a lot of people aren't aware of, and I totally agree with that. And I think that's an acceleration factor as well. So I think that's to my point, which is there's a lot of things that I think where we are in the maturity curve of AI is that there's a lot of stuff that's there that's helping people do things a little faster or quicker, whether that be learning or doing. But I think where we're still getting hung up is that it's still um, AI assisted. So it's still people doing all the things with the help of AI, even
yeah,
to the point where it's like debugging and testing and everything. So I think we're at a point now where you still have to have a person kind of go in and use AI to do all of the steps along the way. And I think for me personally, I think one of the more interesting things, aspects of like, it's probably not AI, it's probably more machine learning, which is around sort of on the diagnostic side, which I think
yeah,
is, I think that's a huge untapped area when you're looking at things at scale. But yeah, like I wouldn't be too worried right now about one or two people using AI to cobble together a bunch of open source stuff and making a scalable, secure, enterprise grade platform. Again, that could be famous last words, but
yeah,
I still think we're a little ways off from that. And even to the point where if I were in a company as an executive, would I want to be putting all of my eggs in that basket internally as well and saying, hey, I'm going to spin up 5 people and they're going to go solve this thing? I wouldn't. That's a risk I probably wouldn't put too too much of a bet on.
Yeah, well, you're making me think maybe one guiding, uh, I don't know, piece of advice or whatever framing for what to do with AI in platform engineering ops stuff or platform engineering specifically is maybe one major area is to think about how you could improve user experience for using the platform. Basically, improve the way not only developers but other stakeholders use that. And so, we have several colleagues who, not that it's super easy, but it's definitely possible to like have a chat interface to like running, configuring and figuring out like what's running in the Tanzu platform. Just you
Right.
hook it up and the Cloud Foundry API and the Tanzu platform API are known, and just like that's the magic of AI. It works.
Yeah.
Right. And thinking even beyond that if a developer, as developers become comfortable doing that for their own work, right? Will they want to interact with the platform in that same way? And I mean, I think the answer is obviously yes, right?
Yeah.
Like, write this code for me. We're going to be doing the code and now deploy it. And
Yeah.
like, now tell me about it. Now do all of that. So that seems like a pretty obvious thing for a platform engineering team to focus on, is just like, let's look at all the top 5 interactions that developers have with the platform. And what if they did this through like a chat interface, right?
Right.
And what do we need to support that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think one of the reasons why our platform has been, so popular for so long is, I would argue, it's sort of been an AI like experience from the first day. Like when you first do the CF push and you know, you're kind of blown away. It's like, how does it know what code I'm using and like the build pack to choose and write all of these things? I think it's a pretty magical experience the first time. But I think to your point, what I would say is I think AI machine learning is really good at taking things that no human is doing or could do. And that usually means dealing with large data sets at scale, right? And then
Yeah.
giving you meaningful insights or patterns and, outlier detection and that sort of thing. I think where it's working towards, but we're not there yet, is still this concept of like, generating and creating things that work at scale. And like we still need humans for that. And we still have humans that can do that. And I think, arguably there's still the opinion that a, good set of experienced humans are still better at that. However, I think they can be accelerated and be a little bit more productive using AI tools. So I think the hurdle we have to get over is um, when we can rely on the technology, to your point, where it can do more of those things with us without human intervention, and then like trusting it and feeling good about it. So yeah, like I don't know when that'll happen, but I think that's the direction we're heading. But to your point, the developer experience is I agree. It would be more of a, like Jarvis kind of thing. That would be awesome, right? Like if, if you
Yeah.
could interact with the platform in a way, to your point, even from an operator or a developer perspective, where, the top 2 or 3 things you're doing, it does more of it for you. And I think more importantly, is it's giving you very interesting feedback on how that's gone and how it's behaving. And then kind of asking you, like, hey, like based on what I'm seeing, I would recommend kind of doing this or this, but there's a chance it could be this. Like, how do you want to proceed, kind of thing? Like, I think that would be pretty awesome.
Yeah, and there's an interesting like you brought up like the usability of like, as people say, the CF push experience, right? Like of using the Cloud Foundry way of doing things. And I guess you're reminding me of another conversation I was having. Like the I would think of that as a declarative way of doing things, to show my age, instead of an imperative way, right? And
Right.
and what that means is basically like, with the Cloud Foundry way of thinking of deploying, and Kubernetes is in, I don't know, it's a different shade of this, but it's kind of thinking of that. I don't quite understand the exact differences, or I should say, I'd have to think a long time about it. But with the Cloud Foundry way of doing stuff, you're like, I've got a Java application and I want it deployed and I want it to connect to a database. And the whole usability part is like the developer isn't real. They don't need to know the details beyond what I just said. And like, it's almost like the dream of what I think DNS should be for me, where I would just say like, I want this English word when I type it into this thing to make this program execute. Whereas like, that's not how DNS works. It's got all this weird stuff going on. But,
Right.
So you set up your networking routes and what it's going to look like. And so what's an interesting connection there is like that kind of interacting is more or less what it's like to like do code generation with an AI. You can say, do this specific implementation, use this code, use that, but then you're sort of like not doing it.
Yes, exactly.
Right?
Yes.
And so it's a similar mindset of like, instead of explicitly talking about have this container configured this way, wired up over here to this container with this configuration to do that, the developer can stay in that mindset of just like, I don't know, I'll just tell it what I want, as you would say, the business outcome, or maybe it's the technical outcome. And I think maybe the other thing that's interesting, since like the Cloud Foundry approach works that way, it's already built for that. But then you also have another angle of like, let's say you had a build pack, which is the way that the primary way you deploy stuff to Cloud Foundry. The AI itself can just call the build pack to do it. And then the platform engineers can actually have some control over what the build pack does. So you don't even have to like, if you don't want to, the AI doesn't have to go all the way into the system. You can still have all sorts of checkpoints about what's working there, because it's very compatible, the way these things work.
No, I agree. That's a good point. I agree. And you actually brought up a really good example of where I think there's some room for improvement, right? Which is being very declarative. You're correct. Like today, a developer would still have to, deploy their app or their service. They have to think about the other services they want to bind to and create. I think it would be very interesting instead, to your point, like if you just start early with code generation and you're saying, hey, this is what I want you to do, then I think on the platform AI side, when it's looking at that and deploying, it goes, oh, I see that you need databases, right? And
yeah,
and like I think that would be a very cool next step, which is it's almost like AI architecture, sort of, which I think is like very interesting. I don't know what you would call that, but yeah, I think that would be a very profound user experience.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to whiteboard that out or blue sky solution engineer it some more. Like it is, part of the user experience could be, like the developer is like, I want to run this, and I don't know, it should have failover, and it needs a database that like doesn't lose the data. Right? Like this would be like me if I was doing this. And what the platform engineer could do is kind of like through an AI understanding, like if I literally type that, the platform engineer would set things up to make sure that the AI was like, oh, what this translates to is running like, I don't know what it, since I said I don't know what it is, but like it translates into running like 3 nodes of this and like different zones, and like this type of database with this capacity. And so there's almost, you could rely on the AI figuring out what that actually means, as far as not even the exact configuration that goes in some YAML file,
right?
But just like the commands to call.
Yeah, yeah.
Right?
No, and we talked about this before, and I think when I was saying I think most good platform teams, they set up architectures kind of based on very popular demographics, right? Like they have application demographics within their companies. For example, does this have to be externally exposed or just internally exposed? You can talk about eventual consistency. You can talk about failover. Like you could talk multi-region. Like to your point, there's a lot of things that sort of create all of the sort of multiplicative like sort of pathing that an architecture can take, I think it would be really cool, because I still see a lot of companies struggling with that, where AI could kind of take a lot of that burden
Yeah,
on
and
and do that.
I could see based on like the way I've messed around with making like MCP servers and skills and to play Dungeons and Dragons with these things over the past year or two.
Which is awesome, by the way. I think it's so cool.
Yeah, you could, as you are building up that competency, you would use like a human in the loop scenario where the platform engineering group could kind of like train is a confusing word in this context, but they could educate. I'll say that they could educate the AI to like know what it meant if I was like, I need to deploy this for our Netherlands customers, right? And like with a certain amount of like just even like I think RAG stuff and education, but also like mixing in skills and stuff. It should be smart enough to know that like, oh, that means deploy to these two data centers, in one in Netherlands and then one in Germany, whatever, right?
Right, right.
You could kind of you could do what AIs do. You could translate natural language into like computer talk.
Yeah.
to be purposely goofy about it. But you could also say like, you could instruct it of like, if you don't know what this means, like call me, the human. And then at that, like the developer might have to wait, but then it basically, or it might be automatic, and like a platform engineer could come and like help the person do their task, and then go in and add that, educate the AI about it again to say like, here's what that means. And then that might mean, like writing a skill or whatever. Like the example I was thinking of is, there's a way of playing D&D. Well, not a way. There's a tool that's like a deck of cards and it has random stuff on it. And so like you can make a skill that's like every time someone wants to draw a card, show them one of these cards, which is obvious. But you could also say like, let's have a what kind of stuff is in the treasure chest? And then if the skill exists and the card is like, among other things, this card will tell you what kind of stuff is in a treasure chest. Then like instantly the AI is like, I've encountered a treasure chest. I'll call this thing to find it out.
Yeah.
Right. And so you could be like, here's the data center placement thing. And it's like, someone said data center. Let me go call this thing and look. Anyways. But
no, I think what I'm hearing, correct me if I'm wrong, because I think there is a lot of sort of declarative kind of branching logic stuff. But I think what I'm hearing more is training an AI on sort of like your, going back to like domain language, right? Like your business and architecture has a language. And I think it would be interesting to have that baked into your sort of platform, AI. Right. I think that's a really interesting idea. And I would be shocked if someone's not already working on that. But if they are, I'm not aware of it. I think that's something I'm probably going to have to go research now.
Yeah. like yourself, this is one of those topics where my suspicion is that there are no new ideas here.
Right, exactly.
There's just like web searches I haven't done yet.
Exactly.
That's what's lacking. But that's great. Like it makes it fun. But yeah, I mean, like we're saying, there's a lot of demos that like our people have done and work along these lines. So it starts to. I think the thing that's different in like February 10th of 2026 is like a lot of those demos and ideas that everyone had over the past 3 years were sort of like hopes and dreams of doing things, right? Like, but now it's like, now if you've had at least a year of firsthand experience, you're like, yeah, I can totally see how this would work, right? It's not just weird made up stuff.
To kind of, and I hadn't thought about this before, but to put a little bit of a bow on it, you got me thinking. I think where the most profound place to be in this environment is what I would consider has been the sort of the goal for a long time, which is to, if you are a business line leader or an organization within a large enterprise, there's typically and traditionally, we've sort of been advocating for, big shared services groups that take care of a lot of these enterprise problems for business line leaders. And I think there's a lot of friction and organizational stuff that comes with that. But I think if we're talking about, similar that we've talked about democratizing AI, if AI could be used to kind of wrestle the power back away from IT groups and shared services
Mm.
and allow each business line leader to use a very small group of people to provide them their platform, and run it for them, more importantly, I think that would be a very profound place, which is that this notion of a big shared services centralized IT group now gets dispersed, and it's sort of living in each of the business line leaders organizations. I think, and if AI can help do that, which in theory it could, that would be a really interesting case study to look at.
Hmm. Yeah. So would there be actual like separate platforms running around, or is it different than that?
Yeah, I think it's I think the platform is mostly the same because, to your point, it's still a combination of a lot of declarative stuff. But I think what I'm getting at is, and it's similar to the problem that we were talking about in the very beginning, is instead of having to have this 100-person centralized IT organization, right, that's running all of these things, I think you could take 4 to 5 people and run it their own instance of this, right, and
Mm.
for each of the business line leaders, and still taking care of all of the interesting sort of enterprisey concerns. Um, I think that would be a really interesting thing to take a look
Yeah.
at.
Yeah. Like, and then maybe a version of that is you could you could even have the same or similar platforms underneath, but if you had this kind of chat interface into it, you could customize the experience of using it to
Exactly.
however that group
Right.
wanted, right?
Yeah,
And so like,
exactly.
and that to prevent platform sprawl, that relies on having like I never like the word primitive, but like that standardized stuff in a
Yeah.
platform. And then the group, whether it's in the line of business or it's elsewhere, like the platform engineers, they now take that standard platform and they have it present or have it interact with different groups the way that they want, right? And
Yeah.
that would be an interesting compromise of like, it is both the bane of vendors who want to sell you software, and then people who are left running this stuff. But like, every group needs its own special thing. Not every group, but frequently they do. And you could almost compromise and say like, all right, the way you interact with the platform, you can have that be however you want. That's your job, right?
Yeah,
But that
yeah.
doesn't leak down to the platform. You just like that layer, do whatever you want. We don't care, but it just gets reduced down to like the same way that everyone else uses a platform. So you're you're putting a pig on lipstick, so to speak. However you want it, you can have it.
Yeah, I think another way to put it though is, it's because we've talked about this in so many episodes where, complex systems, and it's the handshaking and communicating between the systems. It's also, you know, it's the organizational things. And I think if you were a business line that could have and we've talked about this too for even us internally, right? Like we want to, foundations, and we want to vend foundations. I think what we're saying is using AI on the operational side so that you can vend these platforms, right, per business line leader. And I think you get all of this organizational benefit from that. And the biggest one that comes to mind immediately to me is like around maintenance windows and patching and scheduling.
Mm,
Like it's just so difficult for these large shared services with like all of this multi-tenant stuff to do that in a way that all of the business line leaders feel comfortable about or want to coordinate. And so again, like we're just reducing the overhead, the noise that gets generated by the need to coordinate.
right.
And I think, but if you could do that without making any compromises around what the platform is doing and how it does it, especially around all the ility stuff and security and dependability, I think that's a really fascinating use case.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll have to go off and do our web searches
Exactly.
and see what people are thinking about this. But yeah, I mean, I think there's we've regardless of what people are already doing, there's obviously a lot of interesting stuff just ways you could improve, like running platforms out there. And I don't know, it'll be fun to see if we were just dreaming or if
Yeah.
there's actually we'll have to pay attention to it some more. So speaking of things we'll have to pay attention to more, it's been another Tanzu Catsup, Tony. I don't know, this is our 8th or 9th episode, I think.
Hard to believe.
Yeah, and so if you've watched this far or you're seeing it, we do this we skipped last week, but more or less we do it every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Amsterdam time and 10 a.m. Eastern time.
Nailed it.
Yeah, we mostly talk about platform engineering. We might have a guest here and there, but if you subscribe to or keep an eye on the VMware Tanzu channel on YouTube, that's what it will be. Along with some little shorts that I put out here and there. I ask it to auto find the shorts that are good.
Yeah.
It always finds you. I've never appeared in the shorts.
That's impossible. That's not possible.
So you're always there. So you can see the best excerpts with that. Well, with that, we'll see everyone next time. Bye-bye.
See ya.